Part 1. Before the blood. In the time before blood, before sacrifice, before the darkness that would consume generations, the world knew peace. Listen carefully to this tale, for it begins not with horror, but with beauty. Not with screams, but with laughter. Not with blood, but with water, clean, pure water that flowed from mountain springs into the valleys where people made their homes. The village of Corvara nestled in a green valley between two gentle mountains. These were not the harsh, jagged peaks that would later become prison walls, but rounded hills covered in wildflowers. Children would race to their summits on summer mornings, competing to be the first to see the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and amber. In those days, and mark this well, for such days would never come again, the harvests were generous. Wheat grew tall and golden, bending in waves when the wind passed through like the breath of benevolent gods. Apple trees bore fruit so sweet that travelers would journey for days just to taste them. The shepherds' flocks were fat and healthy, their wool thick and white as fresh snow. There was an order to life then, a rhythm as natural as breathing. Spring brought the planting, with whole families working the dark, rich soil, singing songs that had been passed down since before memory. Summer was for tending and growing, for long days that stretched into warm evenings where the old ones would sit outside their homes, sharing stories while children caught fireflies in clay jars. Autumn meant harvest, the most joyous time of all. The entire village would work together, men cutting wheat, women binding sheaves, children gathering the fallen grains that would be ground into flour for the winter bread. And when the work was done, when the storehouses were full, they would feast. Such feast. Tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, preserved fruits, and wine that flowed like the rivers themselves. Winter was for rest, for repair, for the making of new tools and the mending of old ones. Families would gather around their hearths, the grandparents teaching the young ones the skills they would need come spring. How to read the weather in the movement of clouds. How to know when soil was ready for planting. How to treat a sick lamb or birth a calf. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, from mouth to ear, an unbroken chain stretching back to the first people who settled this valley. The gods, in those days, asked for little. A portion of the harvest burned in the temple fire. The first fruits of summer laid upon the altar. Simple prayers of gratitude spoken at dawn and dusk. The priests were guides then, not rulers. They taught the calendar, blessed marriages, named children, and tended the sick with herbs from the temple gardens. There was balance. But if you have lived long enough, you know that balance is the most fragile thing in all creation. It takes generations to build and moments to destroy. Like a spider's web heavy with morning dew, beautiful, perfect, and doomed to break at the first strong wind. The first signs were small, so small that many chose not to see them. The spring rains came a week late one year. Not a disaster, the seed still sprouted, the harvest still came. But the old farmers noticed. They remembered their fathers speaking of times when the rains had failed altogether, though surely those were just stories meant to make children grateful for what they had. The next year, the rains were on time, but lighter than usual. The wheat grew, but not as tall. The apples were smaller, though just as sweet.
A minor variation. The cycles of nature, nothing more.
But the third year, the rains didn't come at all. At first, people drew water from the wells and irrigated their fields by hand. Backbreaking work, but they were strong, united. They would survive this trial as they had survived others. The community pulled together, sharing water, sharing labor, sharing hope. Then the wells began to run dry. It started with the shallow ones, the ones dug by individual families for their household use. Then the deeper community wells began to show bottom, their water turning brackish and brown. Only the temple well, the ancient one said to have been blessed by the first priests, continued to flow clear. The harvest failed. Oh, there was some grain, some withered vegetables, a few hard apples no bigger than a child's fist. But not enough. Not nearly enough to feed everyone through the winter. That was when the first whispers began. Not of hope or unity, but of blame. Why have the gods turned from us? What have we done to deserve this punishment? Who among us has brought this curse? The priests, who had been guides, now found themselves looked to for answers they didn't have. They consulted the old texts, performed the ancient rituals, made offerings of what little they had. But the skies remained bronze and cloudless. The earth turned hard as iron. Then came the sickness. It started in the weakest, the very old, the very young. A fever that burned through the body like wildfire, leaving its victims delirious, crying out visions of darkness and blood. The temple herbs might have helped, but the gardens had withered with everything else. The priests did what they could with prayer and comfort, but prayers don't lower fevers, and comfort doesn't stop the spreading of disease. Within a moon's turning, a quarter of the village was dead or dying. That was when Matthias, the high priest, an old man who had served the temple for 50 years, had his vision. Or said he did. To this day, no one knows if the gods truly spoke to him, or if desperation and fever created the voice he claimed to hear.
Blood. The gods demand blood. We have forgotten the old ways, the deep ways. We have grown soft, offering only grain and fruit when what the heavens require is the ultimate sacrifice.
The crowd recoiled. Human sacrifice had been abandoned generations ago, relegated to dark stories told to frighten children into obedience. Surely, they were beyond such barbarism. But then young Thomas, the blacksmith's son, stood up. His wife had died the day before, his infant son that very morning.
If blood will bring the rains, then let the gods have blood.
And so it began. Not all at once. Not with the wholesale slaughter that would come later. But with a single criminal, a thief who had been caught stealing food from the temple stores. Instead of exile, which was the traditional punishment, they bound him to the altar stone and opened his throat with a bronze knife that had not tasted blood in living memory. That night, it rained. Just a brief shower, barely enough to dampen the dust, but rain nonetheless. The people fell to their knees, weeping with relief and terrible understanding. The gods had spoken. Blood was the price of survival. The second sacrifice came a week later, a woman accused of adultery, though the evidence was thin. The third, a madman who talked to invisible spirits. The fourth, an elderly widower who volunteered, saying he was tired and ready to join his wife in the next world. Each death brought rain. Not enough to save the harvest, but enough to keep hope alive. Enough to fill a few wells. Enough to make the people believe that perhaps, with sufficient offerings, the gods would fully restore their favor. By winter, the sacrifices had become routine. Monthly at first, then weekly as the desperation grew. The priests developed elaborate rituals, painted symbols on the altar stone, chanted in languages that had been dead for centuries. They wore robes of deep crimson, to honor the blood that bought their survival. And they developed criteria for choosing the sacrifices. At first, it had been criminals and volunteers. But criminals became scarce, fear of the altar made people extraordinarily law-abiding. And volunteers, well, the survival instinct is strong, even in the desperate. So the priests created new standards. The sacrifices must be worthy, their blood must be an appropriate offering to the gods. But paradoxically, they couldn't be too valuable to the community. They needed the strong to work, the skilled to craft, the fertile to breed the next generation. What they needed were the disposable. The weak but not dying. The strange but not useful. The ones who consumed resources without contributing enough in return. They needed the unworthy to be worthy of sacrifice. This was the world that awaited two men who didn't yet know their fate. Two men who were about to learn that there are things worse than being chosen for death. There are things like being rejected for it. The harmony was broken. The age of blood had begun. And in that blood, something far darker than anyone could imagine was about to be born. For the gods, you see, have a sense of irony. They had been offered blood to save the village from destruction. But in rejecting two men as unworthy even for sacrifice, the village had unknowingly set in motion its own doom. This is where our true story begins. Not with the worthy who died on the altar, but with the unworthy who were cast into the wasteland. Not with those whose blood satisfied the gods, but with one whose blood would become something else entirely. Something that would make the gods themselves tremble. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we must meet the condemned. First, we must understand how one becomes too worthless even for death. First, We must walk the path that leads to the birth of the monster. The transformation of Corvara from paradise to purgatory began with whispers. Not screams, not proclamations, but whispers. The kind that start in corners of markets, in the shadows of doorways, in the space between sleep and waking where fear lives. The Henderson's baby was born with a twisted foot. The wheat in the southern field has blight. Old Martha says she saw a crow flying backwards. The moon last night, did you see? It had a red ring. Signs and portents. Omens and warnings. In the age of harmony, these would have been dismissed, explained away, forgotten by morning. But when the first harvest failed, those whispers grew louder. It had been 3 generations since anyone in Corvara had known real hardship. The grandparents' told stories of difficult times, but they were distant tales, like legends of dragons or heroes. The living memory knew only abundance, which made the failure all the more terrifying. The wheat simply didn't grow. The seeds were good, they'd been saved from the best of last year's crop, as always. The soil was prepared with the same care, the same prayers, the same time-tested methods. But when the green shoots should have pushed through the earth, reaching for the sun, there was nothing. Just bare ground, hard and unyielding. The farmers dug up the seeds, thinking perhaps they'd been planted too deep. They found them rotted, black, stinking of decay that shouldn't have been possible in the dry earth. We'll replant. Sometimes these things happen. But the second planting failed too. And the third. By then, it was too late in the season for another attempt. The village would have to survive on stored grain, preserved foods, what they could hunt and gather. Not comfortable, but survivable. If it was just one bad year. It wasn't. The sickness came with the first winter winds. It started with the Blackstone family, all 6 of them fell ill on the same night. Fever, delirium, a rash that looked like red tears weeping from the skin. The herb woman, Agnes, did what she could with her tinctures and poultices, but nothing helped. Within 3 days, all 6 were dead. The bodies were burned. Agnes insisted on it, despite the traditional preference for burial.
This sickness is unnatural. We cannot let it seep into the earth.
But burning didn't stop it from spreading. The millers fell next, then the potters, then old Samuel who lived alone by the river. No pattern to who it took, young and old, strong and weak, pious and skeptical. The only mercy was that it killed quickly. By winter's end, 1 in 5 houses stood empty. Spring brought no relief. The rains that should have come to soften the earth for planting never arrived. The sky remained a merciless blue, the sun a tyrant that baked the ground to the consistency of fired clay. The river that had never run dry in living memory shrank to a trickle, then to isolated pools of stagnant water where dead fish rotted. This was when the priests began to speak differently in temple. High priest Matthias was 73 years old, had served the temple for 50 years. He had performed 1,000 marriages, blessed 10,000 meals, guided the community through small troubles and large celebrations. He was a man of gentle wisdom, or had been, before the weight of his people's suffering broke something inside him.
We must consider that we have somehow offended the heavens.
The congregation shifted uneasily. Offended how? They had kept the festivals, made the offerings, said the prayers. What more could the gods want?
In the old times, our ancestors understood that the gods require significant demonstrations of faith, of sacrifice.
Elder Catherine, 90 years old and sharp as a blade, spoke up from her place of honor in the front row.
You speak of blood offerings, Matthias. We left those ways behind generations ago. We are civilized now.
And what has our civilization brought us? Empty fields. Empty bellies. Empty houses where families once left. Perhaps civilization is the problem. Perhaps we have grown too proud, too comfortable, too unwilling to pay the true price of divine favor.
The argument that night was fierce but brief. The empty stomachs and fresh graves gave weight to Matthias's words that no amount of philosophical objection could counter. When you're watching your children starve, you'll consider anything. When plague walks through your door, you'll try any cure. But they didn't start with human sacrifice. Not yet. That leap was too far, even for the desperate. They began with animals. The few livestock that had survived the plague and drought were brought to the temple. Not just portions of meat as had been traditional, but entire animals, their throats cut over the altar stone while the priests chanted words that hadn't been spoken in centuries. The blood ran thick and dark, pooling in the carved channels of the altar, dripping into bronze bowls that the priests raised to the sky. The meat was burned entirely, not a morsel saved for the starving people. The gods must have it all, Matthias insisted. Half measures were what had brought this catastrophe. That night, clouds gathered. Just a few at first, wisps on the horizon. But by morning, the sky was grey, and by afternoon, rain was falling. Not a deluge, not enough to save the failed crops, but rain nonetheless. The first in almost a year. The people wept. They danced. They praised the gods and the priests who had remembered the old ways. And when the rain stopped after just one day, they didn't despair. They simply brought more animals. But there weren't many animals left. The drought and disease had claimed most of the herds. Within a month, they had sacrificed every cow, every sheep, every goat. They moved on to chickens, to dogs, to cats. Anything that bled. Each sacrifice brought a little rain, a small reprieve from the sickness, a successful hunt. Just enough to keep hope alive. Just enough to demand more. When they ran out of animals, Matthias retreated to the temple's deep archives, the underground chambers where the oldest texts were kept. Scrolls and tablets that predated the village itself, written in languages that hurt to read, describing rituals that had been forbidden for good reason. He emerged after 7 days, and those who saw him said he had aged a decade. His hair, still partially brown when he descended, was now white as bone. His hands shook constantly, and his eyes had seen something that had changed him fundamentally.
I have found the answer. The gods have shown me why our offerings fail to fully restore their favor.
He produced a scroll, black with age, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight.
We offer the blood of beasts, but the gods made a covenant with men, not animals. The blood of beasts is a token, a gesture. But to truly communicate with the divine, to truly show our devotion, we must offer human blood.
The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even breathing seemed to stop.
You're talking about murder, Matthias.
I'm talking about survival. I'm talking about salvation. One life to save hundreds. Is that not a worthy trade?
And who would be chosen?
Matthias had clearly thought about this.
The condemned. We have 3 prisoners awaiting judgment for crimes. Thieves and worse. Their lives are already forfeit. Instead of simple execution, let them serve a higher purpose. Let their deaths mean something.
It was a seductive argument. These were people already sentenced to die. Why not let their deaths serve the community they had wronged? The vote was closer than Matthias had hoped. 7 in favor, 6 against. But a majority was all he needed. The first human sacrifice took place on the night of the new moon. The victim was a man named Porter, who had killed his brother in a drunken rage over a land dispute. He was brought to the altar in chains, forced to kneel before the stone that had drunk so much animal blood. The ritual was elaborate. The priests had painted themselves with symbols from the ancient texts, their faces hidden behind masks of bronze and leather. They chanted in the old tongue, words that predated any language currently spoken in the valley. Incense burned in great braziers, filling the air with smoke that made the watchers dizzy and compliant. Porter begged at first. Then cursed. Then, as the knife approached his throat, he simply closed his eyes and whispered his wife's name. The cut was clean, professional. Matthias had practiced on animals until his hand was steady. The blood poured out, so much more than from any beast, hot and dark in the firelight. It ran into the altar's channels, and something changed. The stone began to glow. Faintly, barely visible, but undeniable. The blood didn't just pool, it was absorbed, drunk by the ancient stone as if it were parched earth receiving water. Thunder rumbled overhead. Not the distant suggestion of storm, but immediate, present, as if the gods themselves were acknowledging the offering. It rained for 3 days. Not the brief showers that animal sacrifice had brought, but real rain. Steady, soaking rain that filled the wells, revived the river, turned the hard earth soft again. The sickness retreated, no new cases, and some of the ill actually recovered. The village had its answer. Human blood was the price of survival. But prices, once paid, have a way of increasing. End of episode 1. Before the Blood.